Okay, good morning everybody. I'm Peter Williams. I'm a senior lecturer at the Liverpool Centre for Advanced Policing here at Liverpool John Moores University. I'm joined this morning by my colleague Dr. James Crossland, and we're going to be talking about aspects in relation to 9/11. In my case, I'll be focusing primarily on the implications for UK policing, particularly in the area, in the specialist area of counter-terrorism policing, which has been largely shaped by the events of 9/11 and what has happened in the subsequent 20 years.
And as a historian, I will be providing the broader context for why the 9/11 attacks happened and what has happened in the 20 years since then. Welcome to 1823 podcast. So, Peter, if I can just start, what were your initial reactions when 9/11 happened? Where were you? What do you recall?
Well, I actually remember it was a day like it is today. Actually, obviously it was in New York. All the commentators have spoken about how nice a day. It was very much a summer's day, like it was. And it was a nice day here in Liverpool. And I was still a serving police officer at the time at a police station in South Liverpool. I was a sergeant at the time, and the duty inspector came down to where I was working and said, can you just turn the television on? He said, it looks like there's been a plane has actually flown into the World Trade Centre in New York. He said, I was there a few months ago during the summer months. So we turned the television on, the people that were there, and that was the first plane. And we actually saw the events live, if you like, of the second plane going in and everything, the aftermath from that. So I remember that day well. I probably reflected at the time and thought this is seriously going to change things about a lot of issues really, but probably. Then I underestimated just how it's going to impinge on all our lives.
I think most of us did in that moment. It was that thing where you know that something major has happened, but trying to figure out exactly what the implications are. I think everyone was scrabbling for that at the time. I remember thinking, because I knew who al-Qaeda were at this time, and knew of prior attacks that had been committed, the bombing of the USS Cole the year before, and the bombings of the embassies in Tanzania and Nairobi. And the thing that I remember thinking about was, how did they pull this off? Like what? This was in the parlance, it's a terror spectacular. It was designed to do exactly what it did in that police station. It grabbed all eyes, everyone was fixed to it, and panicked everyone who saw those images. Those images still resonate. We were talking before off camera about the documentary that was recently on, and just rewatching that, I got this real sense of just being taken back to this moment of real genuine confusion, which seems to be, that's most people's reflection, isn't it? You'll be hard pressed to find anyone who was like, yes, I understand precisely what this is and how this is going to fan out. Did you get any sense, being an active police officer at the time, were there any sort of briefings? Were there any, okay, this is now something has to happen here, or was there a similar sense of?
No, it wasn't like that at all. Although for me personally, it was slightly different. But I'll explain why in a minute. But the issues within the police service at the time was that this was only 3 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and for the sort of previous, certainly for the whole incorporated my service, the issue in relation to terrorism was related exclusively to Irish dissidents.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, with the signing of the agreement in 1998, there was almost a sense of relief. Well, that's the end of that,
Mm-hmm.
and we can sort of get back to almost like mainstream policing. Now, I think I can illustrate what I'm saying because the legislation that existed in the UK at the time was the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was passed in 1974 with the brackets temporary provisions.
As a response to the Troubles.
As a response to the Troubles, exactly. And the Home Secretary at the time, Roy Jenkins, who was a Labour minister, his statement to Parliament, this was a draconian measure, but necessary in these unprecedented times. So that's the way it was perceived. The issue of terrorism, if you like, it stood outside mainstream policing.
It wasn't going to be a permanent fixture. It wasn't going to be. It was going to be a thing.
Exactly. If this is a hump, if you like, in the road, we've got to get over, and then we'll sort of move back to normal. So there was that part to it. Interestingly enough, what a lot of people forget about is a group that operated in London in the early 70s, known as the Angry Brigade, and they operated for about 2 years. Very much a new left.
Oh yeah.
In their motivations, okay. So there potentially would have been links with like the Red Brigade and the Baader-Meinhof. Yeah, okay. Fortunately, from their actions, nobody died, although there was a fair bit of damage. And New Scotland Yard or Metropolitan Police had no specific anti-terrorism or counter-terrorism unit, so they formed what was called the Bomb Squad. Okay, now the Bomb Squad later became the anti-terrorism branch, which is now Counter-Terrorism Command. Yeah. So counter-terrorism policing in the UK actually started because of the actions of the Angry Brigade, not because of the actions of the IRA, which is the common perception. Also, when eventually some people were arrested because of the actions of the specialised unit, they were prosecuted under legislation, which was mainstream criminal legislation like conspiracy to cause damage, that sort of thing, because there was no specific legislation. So within the police service, there was that sense of it's over, if you like, we're moving towards normality. Also, in Northern Ireland itself, the government, which of course was led by Tony Blair at the time, had initiated something called the Patton Inquiry, which later became the Patton Report, which formed the basis for what is now the police service in Northern Ireland, a complete revamp of what was the Royal Ulster Constabulary. So there was a sense this is a new dawn. Okay, we're moving away from that. Me personally, because I'd come to this university and I'd done my dissertation into Irish terrorism, that was my personal interest, and I'd read a book called The Spirit of Allah by an author, an Iranian called Amir Tahiri. And it was full of hints about Islamic dissidents. And it was from then I started to pick up on what became al-Qaeda, which you first mentioned in the British newspapers in 1998 through journalists for the likes of Jason Burke, who writes in The Guardian still, and The Observer. So I was sort of conscious that there was other issues out there, but of course, nobody would have predicted as to what we've seen in the subsequent 20 years. No,
there's a sort of tendency to retrospectively ascribe this a sort of power and weight to al-Qaeda on account of that particular terrorist spectacular. What's interesting about, and something that I often have to emphasize to students, many of whom, the ones I teach now, were babies when 9/11 happened, and have no pre-knowledge of that world, trying to sort of explain to them that there was a time when terrorism existed before 9/11, and even the knowledge of the threat of al-Qaeda existed before 9/11. One of the things that we often forget about in our assessments is that this attack did not necessarily come out of nowhere. There was intelligence around. FBI, CIA were aware that there were Saudi nationals who had come into the US and had taken training in flight for planes. knowledge of bin Laden and his intentions went back to 1996, if not earlier. There was a formation of Alex Station in 1996 within the CIA to find bin Laden. So there was already this sort of pre-existing ecosystem, if you like, of an understanding that there's this threat out there and we should try to nip it in the bud. The problem was that the bits and pieces of the intelligence weren't all put together. It was only with hindsight. It's comparable in many ways to Pearl Harbor. Same thing happened where all the bits and pieces were there. It was only after the fact you could see them all come together. And so we get the terrorist spectacular. One of the things that I wanted to raise was what happens after 9/11 and we enter into the war on terror, which is problematic for a number of reasons. Let's actually talk about that a bit. Like the concept of the war on terror. The moment that Bush uttered that, he first said war on terrorism, I believe, just off the cuff, as he tends to or did do, and then he refined that a few days later in a speech to Congress where he said this is a war on terror. And the second he uttered those words, that was leapt on by people who said this has got a lot of problems, not the least of which being you're declaring war on a tactic rather than a state. How did that reconcile on this side of the pond with these perceptions of terrorism? You mentioned briefly before this idea that traditionally terrorists would be pursued as criminals, but now with the classification of the war on terror, all of a sudden they become armed combatants, and this hazy designation where they're neither prisoners of war and therefore can't be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, and they can sort of be treated whatever way necessary. How was that that reconciliation of, okay, now terrorists have gone from being criminals to being something else?
Well, of course, the Americans don't define terrorism to give them that wiggle room where they can sort of almost make a decision as to what suits. Different departments within the American government define it differently. We define it in the Terrorism Act 2000, which was the permanent legislation that replaced that temporary provisions Prevention of Terrorism Act. So in relation to the UK, obviously we were under Tony Blair, we were very supportive of the Americans. And the first military action, if you probably remember, which was from Pakistan into Afghanistan, was called Operation Enduring Freedom, which was launched by the Americans. The idea was that they were going to ensnare al-Qaeda and hopefully bin Laden. But of course, they were able to escape via the Tora Bora Heights, which actually means dark caves. Yes. And of course, they knew the layout better than what we did. And they were able to escape that, which of course, as you will know, James, al-Qaeda effectively scattered from what the Americans referred to across that border as al-Qaeda Central. So the American counter-terrorism policy, as you know, is very much military-led. The UK's response, even though we were supportive of the Americans, is criminal justice-led. So what Tony Blair actually did in 2001, we in the direct aftermath of 9/11, we passed some further legislation, which was the Anti-Terrorism Act, etc. And that basically just strengthened police powers and that sort of thing, but also brought legislation in relation to terrorist financing.
Yes,
which is very much like the Patriot Act, which no doubt you'll refer to. So, and he also, this is the significance, I think, for UK policing. He appointed the first security and intelligence coordinator, which was somebody called Sir David Omond, who had been the director of GCHQ, the government communications listening in station, if you like, in Cheltenham. Now, part of his remit was to formulate the UK's counter-terrorism response, and that formulated itself in 2003 into the UK counter-terrorism strategy, which we're still working towards with now. There's been about 3 updates since, but that's what we've got. And people listening and viewing this will probably heard it. We know it's got the 4 pillars or strategic campaigns, as they call it: prevent, pursue, protect, prepare. Those sorts of things. That was the policy that the UK police forces, in relation to policing, and the intelligence services were now working towards, particularly in the pursue area, which was very much counter-terrorism, because it's very much linked on intelligence. So we are going to proactively go after the bad guys. Prevent, of course, has been subject to, and is now still subject to, another review. But prepare, for example, and protect are very much linked to things like this: anti-terrorism. And we've seen a lot of those, of course, those sorts of measures in relation to physical barriers outside buildings, changes to what happens when we go through airports or transport hubs, those sorts of things. So that has had a profound effect on relation. And it also started to move policing, moving back into the mainstream, where it's become a core element of everyday type policing. So the days of where perhaps in my day the role was to deal with more routine volume crime, that sort of thing, it's moved again because of 9/11 and because of we're working to the UK counter-terrorism strategy. And there's been changes to that as well, and some which were forced or as a result of what happened in relation to 7/7.
So we've got that facet of the war on terror, which is really the counter-terrorism side and policing, at least from our perspective. The other aspect, which is one that historians are going to spend an awful lot of time thinking about, more so because, and I'd be remiss to not note that we're recording this a little over a week removed from Kabul being retaken by the Taliban and the withdrawal of UK and US troops, supposedly the final withdrawal and the end of America's longest conflict. That and the invasion of Iraq are the two, if you like, conventional military operations that are part of, the two major ones at least, that have been part of the war on terror. It's interesting, something that struck me when I was watching the recent images from Kabul. I was thinking about, and all the condemnation that's about the nature of the evacuation and everything else. And I was thinking about, with the 20-year anniversary coming up, reflecting back on when that invasion began. And again, this is something that I have to explain to students because I'm not sure it quite sits, but America was seen as the victim by and large. Like, there was a global outpouring of sympathy for America and a lot of goodwill. You had a UN resolution passed which said the threat of terrorism is an international security threat, and and invoked basically tenets of collective security, saying, we need a concerted cooperative effort because this can destabilize international relations, basically. So this massive international response, and there were obviously people who opposed the war in Afghanistan, but as compared to Iraq in particular, a lot more support for that particular campaign. Do you remember, going back to that time, any sort of thoughts on what are the implications of these overseas operations for policing back here? Because the two things are connected.
Oh yeah, very much so. Well, in the case of Afghanistan, just to take that one, which Tony Blair was particularly enthusiastic about initially, there was the issue of the intent to prevent al-Qaeda to get their hands on WMD,
Yes,
which was which I'm sure listeners know as weapons of mass destruction, which of course the Americans in particular were concerned about, that Iraq was still in possession of because of the Iraq-Iran conflict.
there's a particular concern, sorry not to cut you off, but just to clarify, there's a particular concern, if I remember, about dirty bombs, about
That's
the use
right.
of uranium.
But in relation to policing, in relation to particularly Afghanistan, what they intended to do was to get control of the crop of poppy. Now, as you probably know, poppy eventually can form it into opiate, and of course it forms itself into what we know on the street, if you like, street drugs, as heroin. Mm-hmm. So they were trying to also control that and prevent AQ getting their hands on potentially that crop. Now the world had opened up because of the wall had come down. So moving out of Afghanistan, narco-terrorism we call it, they were able to move into those Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and all those people, and then eventually into Europe, and effectively flood the West with heroin. So that was very much part and parcel of what they were trying to do, and of course it was explained to the population back home was the fact that we've got to take this action. It's necessary in order to keep our streets safer. Now, of course, people can make their own minds up in relation to that, whether or not we went around it. But that was one key element of it, was to get a hold of that narco, the links with the drug trade in particular.
Yeah. So it's finding sort of different layers in addition to the general security issue, and the idea that if you the operational premise being that if you go in, you take out bin Laden, that in theory is the end of al-Qaeda, which obviously wasn't, even after he died in 2011. And by kicking out the Taliban, you then secure the area, and that has this knock-on effect for the drugs trade, amongst other things, as well as, in theory, stomping out one aspect of Islamist terrorism. The results on that have been mixed, I think it's fair to say. And there is this sense now with the events of the last few weeks that we perhaps have come full circle with the Taliban now back, and there's currently a debate over what exactly the implications are for that. And being a historian, I'm not going to try to say this is what's going to happen. But to go back to just thinking about if we're working on this narrative which is out there now, which is that everything has ended up back with the Taliban retaking Kabul, that's the end of that. We've got this sort of torturous circle that's brought us back to this after 20 years. Is there any sort of turning point you can see in the war on terror? Are there moments you can think of that are particularly significant for our understanding?
Yeah, I think 7/7. Of course, one of the other reasons, as you know, why we launched Operation Enduring Freedom was to take possession, destroy the training camps.
Yes.
Now, unfortunately, many of the training camps were in Pakistan, on that border of al-Qaeda, as we refer to as al-Qaeda Central border area. And in those semi-autonomous states in Pakistan, that was often seen as the breeding ground for al-Qaeda. That's well documented. But the important thing of that was the turning point for the UK, I think, was 7/7. Two of the 7/7 bombers had British nationals and citizens had actually attended training camps in Pakistan. Now, when 7/7 happened, people can probably remember where they were, what they were doing. I've got a memory that there was a G7 meeting on, I think at the time, it was in Edinburgh, and that happened, and Tony Blair was sort of appraising people about what had happened. But in relation to policing, from that, we form what we call the regional counter-terrorism units, which are 4 regionally, in addition to Counter-Terrorism Command in London. So there's 5 dotted around the country, and they're supported in the more rural areas by counter-terrorism intelligence units. Now, to come back to the counter-terrorism units, for the first time, if you like, the intelligence services moved out of London to be part and parcel because they're multi-agency. So you've got, obviously, the police-led, But they've got obviously specialist detectives, intelligence officers, finance officers, forensic people, those sorts of things. Very much a self-supporting type.
It's a proper devolution of
absolutely, and moving. Although in terrorism operations, New Scotland Yard retained primacy throughout Great Britain. Very much, as you say, that's a good word to use. There was a devolution across there, and I think, particularly from the intelligence side, from Pursue, I actually think they've been a very good investment. I think they've stood the test of time. Obviously, 2017, we had our major attacks in London and Manchester, but they were the first mass casualty attacks on UK soil since 7/7. Whereas we'd seen what happened in France and in other main European countries, Belgium, places like that, which I'm sure everybody can remember. So I actually think we've done quite well there, and that was a good investment. They've stood the test of time. I mean, it's not just the Pursue element, which is, as I said earlier, it's proactive. It's very much where they've got people who are in the protect and prepare, where they are out advising businesses, schools, those sorts of things, in the area of anti-terrorism. So I think that's been a plus.
Yeah. I think about the sort of, I guess, broader societal impacts of the war on terror and everything else, and I'm always taken back to the invasion of Iraq as this sort of this moment where the goodwill I spoke about before with Afghanistan, such as it was, that goes out the window. I remember there's a distinct lack of support for Iraq. It's the UN's advice on it is rejected. We later find out that there are no weapons of mass destruction. It leads to, amongst other things, Tony Blair having to write off. That, I think, was a major turning point in that it kind of turned those who were perhaps cynical about the concept of the war on terror became even more cynical about it. And I think that had a knock-on effect over people's general attitudes to everything, from the ground up, from policing, from security at airports, to everything. There's this, I think it brought about this layer of cynicism. And that seems to have really continued and is kind of where we're up to now. And I think that's part of where the reaction to what's recently happened in Afghanistan, a lot of that has come from, is this idea of, was this all worth it? We put you on the spot here, and then again, fine to speculate within reason, but there is this sense now that we might be entering either a new war on terror, because, as you say, the original idea of taking out the camps, taking out Taliban and everything else, that's all now up in the air. We have the threat of a state governed by a government that in the past has supported terrorism. We have no idea where that's going to get to now. But do you think that we might be entering into a new phase of threat from specifically Islamist terrorism, which is worth highlighting because in recent years the worm has turned on that, and the advice from intelligence chiefs and police has been, well, white supremacist terrorism is the thing we should really be looking out for. I do wonder if we might be entering into a phase where there's going to be a renewed concern.
I totally agree, and I'll tell you why I agree. You're absolutely right about the white, the far right groups. They've been identified as a threat, and there's only, as far as I mind now, there's only one, maybe two, which are actually prescribed in this country as designated as a terrorist group in relation to in relation to the far right. But that clearly has been a growing threat. We've seen that. But this particular event, you'll know when I talk about Rappaport's theory and waves of terror.
Yes.
We are, according to David Rappaport, who's an esteemed academic, we have been in this religious wave of terrorism since 1979.
Yes.
And this is the fourth wave, and each individual wave is shaped by a world political event. Okay, so for example, to take this particular wave, the world events that which commenced this particular wave was the 1979 invasion by the Soviets into Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which obviously in Iran, and I of the opinion that this is probably going to be the religious wave Mark II, because I do think this decision by Joe Biden is going to have that political significance, where as you've just said, James, you've got a government like the Taliban, who we know have harboured terrorists now in government mainstream. What I should say for the purposes of the viewers and the listeners, each wave lasts about 45 years, and David Rappaport is of the opinion that this current religious wave, prior to what Joe Biden did, would have ended by about 2025.
Yeah.
And there was some indications, probably, with what we were seeing, that he may have been correct. But I do think we are now going to enter into the fifth wave. And I do think it's got that, it's a decision of that magnitude which will have that significance.
I mean, beyond the theoretical way of putting that together, there's also the fact that in terms of how terrorism works and the importance of momentum and the importance of appearing like you are achieving your goals. If nothing else, the events of the last few weeks have been a massive PR coup for when we go back to the original intent of al-Qaeda, and this has been debated somewhat. Was the initial the fatwas that were issued by bin Laden in the 90s tended to focus on this idea of, I want to kick the Americans out of the Islamic lands. In 2005, a Jordanian journalist put together fatwas and various interviews conducted with al-Qaeda leaders and said, there's something else going on here, where there's this, and he put it together into this thing called I'm sure you're aware of the strategy to the year 2020, which was this idea that al-Qaeda's goal was to create a terror spectacular that would be so horrendous that it would prompt a decision by the United States to invade Afghanistan or any Muslim heartland. That would lead to a further spread of radicalization, a global jihad, and then from there we would get the economic, political, and military weakening of the United States. Now, if that theory can be applied as a grand strategy retrospectively, then right now there's an argument for jihadists to look at that and say, well, we achieved these goals. And that builds a momentum, that builds a sense that, this is not over and we are not in decline. We are actually in the ascendancy, and that is obviously very dangerous.
Well, I agree with that analysis, because I'll tell you the reason why I do. After I mentioned the Soviet invasion in 1979, as you know, that all ended because of the efforts of the Mujahideen.
Yes.
Which translates to Holy Warriors in 1989. And that was the early days of al-Qaeda, if you like. And of course, they were also armed like the Taliban have now found themselves in receipt of American armour.
Yes.
They were armed with Stinger missiles and all those things by the Americans because they wanted the Soviets out, and that's initially, as you probably know, al-Qaeda got their hands on these sort of weapons. But what that did, the defeat of the Soviets, if you like, who were perceived as a world power by the Mujahideen and across the Islamic world, it emboldened people to move towards jihad.
Yeah.
And I think this will have that sort of similar, and that is going to be the key issue, I think, in relation across the Islamic world, in relation to people, a minority of people, of course.
Yes.
A minority of people who are who lean towards the that type of teachings in the Islamic, which the Salafism, as you
Yes.
probably know where all that will come from, and I think that it will have exactly the same effect.
To try and bring these things together by way of conclusion, if that, and again, this is all ifs and caveats because we are living through this right now and we can't be sure of anything. But if, and we're far from the only people saying this. This is being postulated by a number of people right now that we might be entering into a new phase of a threat of that nature. Are we better prepared than we were in?
Well, I was asked that question last week, actually, by a media outlet, and the answer I gave was probably yes. I think, though, in relation to the UK, I think all the public services were caught off guard,
Yes.
and that includes the police and intelligence services. But what I would say, we've got the structures in place now for us to respond far better to this. Particularly, I think, is our intelligence is a lot better. In which, the end of the day, the way to counter-terrorism successfully is via good intelligence. I mean, if you just look what happened, we started by talking about the IRA and what it was intelligence at the end of the day that brought about eventually the Good Friday Agreement, and that they were able to nullify their efforts. And I think we've got that now. Whether or not we probably need more investment resources, well, that's another issue. But I do think our structure is there. And we're in a far better position to respond to it. The difference I see, though, from 20 years ago is what we've not mentioned is there's far more use, of course, of things like the internet and communications.
Yes.
And it's in that area where
Yes.
I think we will find the challenges.
Yes. And that is the, to go back to a thing that all historians have this caveat when they're talking about the present, where it's like we don't actually know. But that is, again, something that is being reevaluated minute by minute, hour by hour. How do we actually work out the use of the internet by radicals, for want of a better term, and how can we actually figure out a way to get around the fact that communications is something that is so easy now for groups. Secret communications, encrypted communications, that's an ongoing issue. I don't know. I would think that beyond intelligence and beyond policing techniques, I think there's probably a broader understanding now of the nature of the threat than there was 20 years ago. And talking about the things that drive terrorism, the ways that there can be forms of intervention, the way the media reports on terrorism. I just think that things have gotten a bit, there's just a broader knowledge base there. And I guess my hope is that
yeah, definitely. I do think there's far more awareness as well amongst the public generally in relation to terrorism. As I said initially, very much it was perceived prior to this as being an Irish problem, if
Yes.
you like, because that's what most people had been socialised to
Yeah.
for the previous 30 years. Of course, it ignored a lot of other things that were going on when it underestimated the religious wave threat, if you like, put it that way. And I do think that is a case, but we've still got work to do in understanding what motivates people. What was it that motivated 3 15-year-old girls to leave East London and get on a plane to Istanbul and end up with ISIS? There's those sorts of things and those sorts of motivations which are going to be challenges, I think, going forward.
Yeah. Well, can't think of a cheery way to end this, I'm afraid, other than to say it's been great to chat about this and reflect
very
on
much
it.
so.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.